Let's talk about Starrcade and the big build-up and the finish. Let's go into the finish in great detail. We had a plan. It was a year-long plan, and it was in motion. And that day, suddenly, it wasn't in motion like it was anymore.
In 1995, WCW had something most wrestling companies could only dream about: money, television exposure, and some of the biggest stars in professional wrestling. Hulk Hogan was there. Randy Savage was there. Ric Flair was there. Sting was there. On paper, WCW had everything it needed to become the biggest wrestling company in the world. But there was one major problem. The product was beginning to feel outdated. While WCW continued relying heavily on established stars and familiar formulas, the wrestling audience was changing. Fans wanted something edgier, more unpredictable, and more connected to the real world. WCW had the talent, but it didn't yet have the kind of story that could completely change the direction of the company. Then in 1996, two outsiders walked into WCW and created exactly that. Scott Hall appeared on Monday Nitro on May 27, 1996, walking through the crowd and demanding attention. He wasn't introduced like a normal wrestler. He didn't behave like someone who had simply signed a contract with WCW. He acted like an outsider who had come to invade the company. Kevin Nash soon followed, and together they began promising that they were going to take over WCW. What made the angle so effective was the uncertainty surrounding it. Hall and Nash had genuinely left the WWF, and WCW used that real-life history to make their invasion feel believable. Fans weren't completely sure where the storyline ended, and reality began. They were presented as outsiders who had entered WCW to destroy the company from within, and they claimed that a third man would eventually join them. That mystery reached its peak at Bash at the Beach on July 7, 1996. Hall and Nash were scheduled to compete in a six-man tag team match, but they still needed their mysterious third partner. Their opponents were Sting, Lex Luger, and Randy Savage, and the entire wrestling world was waiting to discover who would stand beside the outsiders. Then Hulk Hogan appeared. For years, Hogan had been the ultimate hero of professional wrestling. In WCW, he was the biggest star in the company and one of the most recognizable wrestlers on the planet. When he walked toward the ring, many fans assumed he had come to help WCW fight the invasion. Instead, Hogan shocked everyone by attacking Randy Savage. He dropped the leg on Savage and revealed that he was joining Hall and Nash. The reaction was extraordinary. Fans immediately understood that something enormous had happened. Trash began flying into the ring as the audience expressed its anger toward Hogan. The man who had spent years telling fans to believe in Hulkamania had just betrayed them. After the match, Hogan explained that he was tired of being treated like the villain by the fans, and that he had joined Hall and Nash because they represented something new. The red and yellow Hulk Hogan was gone, and Hollywood Hogan had arrived. Together, the three men formed the foundation of the New World Order, or NWO, and professional wrestling entered an entirely different era. The brilliance of the NWO was that it didn't feel like a traditional wrestling faction. Hall and Nash weren't wearing ridiculous costumes or pretending to be cartoon villains. They wore simple black and white clothing, mocked WCW, insulted the fans, and acted as though they were genuinely taking control of the company. Hogan, meanwhile, was the perfect leader because he had been WCW's biggest hero. His betrayal made the invasion personal. The NWO wasn't simply trying to win championships. They wanted to take over WCW itself, and every week they appeared to become more powerful. More wrestlers joined them, more WCW stars were attacked, and the black and white symbol became increasingly difficult for WCW to escape. But the bigger the NWO became, the more obvious one question became: who could stop them? WCW needed someone who represented the company, someone who had the credibility to stand against Hollywood Hogan and everything the NWO represented. That person was Sting. For years, Sting had been one of WCW's most beloved stars. He was colorful, energetic, charismatic, and one of the company's most recognizable babyfaces. He had fought some of the biggest villains in WCW history and had always been positioned as one of the company's ultimate heroes. But the arrival of the NWO would completely change his character. The NWO began creating doubt around Sting by using a fake Sting as part of their manipulation. WCW wrestlers started questioning where the real Sting's loyalty stood, and the situation eventually pushed Sting away from the company. Instead of fighting everyone who doubted him, Sting simply disappeared. Then, when he returned, he was no longer the colorful hero fans remembered. He had transformed into something darker and far more mysterious. His bright clothing was replaced by black. His appearance became heavily influenced by the dark imagery of Brandon Lee's character in The Crow. He carried a baseball bat, painted his face in black and white, and stopped behaving like a traditional wrestling superstar. The biggest change, however, was that Sting stopped talking. He didn't cut long interviews. He didn't appear every week to explain what he was thinking. Instead, he began appearing in the rafters of WCW arenas, silently watching the NWO. Sometimes he would point his baseball bat toward the ring. Sometimes he would descend and attack an NWO member before disappearing again. The company had taken one of its biggest stars and turned him into an almost mythical figure. Sting wasn't simply another wrestler waiting for his next match. He had become a symbol of resistance against the NWO, and every appearance made fans wonder when he would finally come down from the rafters and fight Hollywood Hogan. That decision created one of the longest and most fascinating waiting games in wrestling history. Sting wasn't wrestling regular matches on WCW television. Instead, the company protected the mystery around him. The NWO continued taking control while Sting continued watching. Hogan would appear and brag about the group's power, and somewhere above him, Sting would be watching. The message was obvious. Hogan might control WCW for now, but Sting had not forgotten him. The longer Sting waited, the more important their eventual confrontation became. The timing was also perfect for WCW because the company was entering the most successful period in its history. Nitro was defeating WWF Monday Night Raw in the television ratings week after week, eventually producing the famous 83-week winning streak that became one of the defining statistics of the Monday Night War. The NWO was one of the biggest attractions in professional wrestling, and Sting's mysterious transformation gave WCW another storyline that fans couldn't ignore. The company had a dominant villainous faction and a silent hero who appeared to be waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Every week that passed increased the anticipation. Throughout 1997, the Sting character became even more mysterious. He rarely needed to do anything because the audience already understood the story. He was watching Hogan. He was watching the NWO. And eventually, everyone knew he would have to face Hollywood Hogan. The beauty of the story was its simplicity. Hogan had betrayed WCW and created the NWO. The group had spent more than a year taking control of the company. Sting had disappeared, transformed himself, and waited patiently while watching everything happen. Eventually, the two paths had to collide. By the time WCW reached the end of 1997, the confrontation had become enormous. Starrcade 1997 was scheduled for December 28th, and the main event was finally Sting versus Hollywood Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. This wasn't being promoted like an ordinary championship match. It was the payoff to more than a year of storytelling. Fans had watched Sting change from a colorful hero into a silent, dark figure in the rafters. They had watched Hogan become the leader of the NWO. They had watched the faction grow stronger while Sting waited. Now the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Sting entered Starrcade as the mysterious hero who had spent months watching from above, while Hogan entered as the arrogant leader of the NWO and the reigning WCW World Heavyweight Champion. The atmosphere surrounding the match was enormous because fans weren't simply interested in who would win. They wanted to see whether WCW would finally deliver the moment it had promised them. They wanted Sting to come down from the darkness, defeat Hogan, and finally bring the NWO's domination under control. Unfortunately, the match itself didn't completely live up to the incredible anticipation. Sting had spent an unusually long period away from regular wrestling, and the match was slow compared with what many fans expected from such a massive main event. But the biggest problem wasn't the pace, it was the finish. Hogan eventually appeared to pin Sting, and referee Nick Patrick counted the three. The story was supposed to involve Patrick giving Hogan a fast count, allowing Sting to kick out and exposing the referee's bias. Instead, the count did not come across clearly as an obvious fast count, leaving many viewers confused about what they had just seen. Then Bret Hart entered the situation. Hart had recently joined WCW after leaving the WWF under controversial circumstances, and he came to the ring claiming that the finish was unfair. He argued that Nick Patrick had counted too quickly and demanded that the match be restarted. The match was restarted, and this time Sting won properly, eventually forcing Hogan to submit to the Scorpion Deathlock. Officially, Sting had won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, but the celebration didn't feel as definitive as it should have. After more than a year of anticipation, the audience had expected a clean and unforgettable victory. Instead, the finish had become tangled in a disputed referee decision and Bret Hart's involvement. The emotional payoff was no longer simple. Fans had spent an entire year waiting for Sting to defeat Hogan, yet they were left discussing the referee's count and the restart instead of simply celebrating Sting's victory. the problems continued after Starrcade. Rather than allowing Sting's victory to become the definitive conclusion of the storyline, WCW revisited the controversy and eventually vacated the championship. This meant the Starrcade result didn't provide the clean championship reign fans had expected. Sting eventually regained the WCW World Heavyweight Championship at Super Brawl VIII in February 1998. But by then, the momentum surrounding the original Starrcade payoff had already been damaged. The company had taken what should have been a straightforward conclusion and turned it into another complicated chapter. And that is what makes this entire story so frustrating. WCW had done the difficult part almost perfectly. They had created the NWO, one of the most influential factions in wrestling history. They had turned Hulk Hogan, perhaps the most famous hero in wrestling, into Hollywood Hogan, one of the most hated villains in the business. They had transformed Sting into a silent, mysterious character who didn't need to speak, because his presence alone created anticipation. Most importantly, they had convinced fans to wait more than a year for one specific moment, Sting finally coming down from the rafters to defeat Hogan. The build-up worked because WCW understood something extremely important about wrestling storytelling. Sometimes the best way to make a moment feel important is to make the audience wait for it. Sting's absence created anticipation. His silence created mystery. His appearances in the rafters reminded fans that he was still there watching. Every time Hogan and the NWO celebrated, the audience knew that Sting was somewhere in the darkness. That made the eventual confrontation feel inevitable, and by the time Starrcade arrived, WCW had created one of the most anticipated matches in the history of the company. But the story also demonstrated the danger of making a payoff too complicated. When you spend more than a year promising fans one definitive moment, that moment has to be crystal clear. There cannot be confusion about what happened. There cannot be unnecessary distractions. The audience has to understand immediately that the hero has won and the story has reached its emotional conclusion. Instead, Starrcade 1997 gave fans a controversial finish that required explanations and follow-up decisions. That doesn't erase what Sting had accomplished. The Crow-inspired appearance, the black and white face paint, the baseball bat, the silent appearances in the rafters, and the psychological war against the NWO remain some of the most iconic images of WCW's history. Sting became larger than a normal wrestler during that period. He became the personification of everything fans wanted to see happen to the NWO. He didn't need to wrestle every week because the audience already believed they knew what his eventual mission was. The irony is that WCW had created one of the greatest long-term wrestling stories ever told, but the company struggled when it was finally time to deliver the ending. The NWO invasion had helped WCW reach the top of the wrestling world, while Sting's transformation gave the company one of its most compelling heroes. For a time, everything was working. Nitro was winning the ratings war, the NWO was incredibly popular, and fans were deeply invested in Sting's eventual confrontation with Hogan. But Starrcade showed that creating anticipation and delivering a satisfying payoff are two very different skills. That is why Sting's war against the NWO remains so memorable decades later. Fans don't remember it simply as another championship feud. They remember the feeling of watching Sting stand silently in the rafters while the NWO took over WCW. They remember wondering when he would finally strike. They remember Hollywood Hogan standing at the center of the invasion and Sting waiting patiently for his opportunity. They remember Starrcade 1997 as the night when more than a year of anticipation finally reached its destination, but also as the night when WCW failed to make that destination as clear and powerful as it could have been. The story should have been simple. The NWO invaded WCW, Hollywood Hogan became its leader, Sting disappeared, transformed, waited, and eventually returned to defeat the man responsible. Instead, WCW allowed the finish to become controversial, the championship situation to become complicated, and the emotional payoff to lose some of its power. The frustrating part is that the company had already done the hardest work. The audience was invested. The characters were established. The anticipation was enormous. All WCW needed to do was deliver the ending, and perhaps that is the real tragedy of Sting's story. WCW proved that it could create something legendary. It proved that it could make fans wait, make them care, and make them believe that one match could change everything. But when the moment finally arrived, the company couldn't resist complicating it. Sting's transformation remains one of the greatest character reinventions in wrestling history, and the NWO remains one of the most influential factions ever created. But Starrcade 1997 remains a reminder that in professional wrestling, sometimes the greatest story in the world can still be damaged by the way you choose to finish it.